We're back for another video, and we're going back in time over 60 years, but this time we're going to look at women in our social history. We're going to begin in the 1950s in Britain, and how women were looked and seen, how they expected to act and behave. Now, our legal battles, such as demonstrations, sheer determination, changed the way people viewed women in British society. But was it all over in one night? Or were there consequences, or were there delays? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Women's fight for equal opportunities. So, let's get on with it. But just before that, we are going to go back to 1918, when, thanks to Emily Pankhurst and her gang, that women were allowed to vote. Women over the age of 30, that was. This age wasn't brought down to 21 until 1928, and this was the legal age at the time for both men and women. There are loads of documentaries about this, so it's well worth checking them out. So the 1950s had dawned, and women had spent the last 6 years at work. Factories, munitions, land jobs, important jobs, stuff like that, whilst the men were out fighting the war. But when the men returned, women were supposed to give up their jobs and go back to the kitchen sink and go back to family life. Now, a lot of women, well, at least 45% women, were absolutely glad of that, because they were happy to just go back to running a family and being domestics. But 55% of women were not happy. They felt disgruntled. They got freedom, they'd got choice, they'd got money in their pockets. Why did they ever want to give it up? But unfortunately, they did. It was at the time when it was the men that brought home the bacon, an English phrase for men going out and earning the money whilst the wives stayed at home. Imagine that, eh? You're independent, you're working, you're earning your own money, you're making your own choices, you're buying your own clothes, and suddenly you're back with a chain and ball, or ball and chain. I would have been a bit disgruntled myself, to be honest. Now, not to say that women didn't work in the 1950s, they did, normally taking secretarial jobs or nursing jobs, jobs that were allocated for women. But there was an enforcement, and this enforcement meant that females had to leave their jobs if they ever got married, and this was in order to prepare for their family or wifely duties. Now we're going back to the time when there was no automatic washing machines, there was no dishwashers, no electric steam irons, where housework was a chore, and it could be a 12-hour day, from cooking breakfast, scrubbing, cleaning, and cooking dinner for when the husband got home, which a husband always required to have the meal on the table. And if they had a family, that would also mean boiling nappies and looking after the kids. Now, as for single women, even at school and even at home, they had different types of lessons and training. They were basically being trained to be a wife. Sewing, knitting, cleaning, domestic, cooking was all the subjects that they did, apart from obviously the elementary stuff, whereas men would be trained to do woodwork and metalwork. Never did one ever do the other. And you've only got to know by the language that they had in the 1950s, the way you would use the word spinster. It would be lonely old spinster, wouldn't it? And yet a bachelor would be a proud bachelor, or a career bachelor, or a bachelor flat. See the difference? Now, married women were supposed to be at their husband's side. This would mean cooking dinners for their boss or entertaining family and friends. They were there to be solely at their side and absolutely dedicated. But what if a woman was unhappy in her marriage? How easy was it to get a divorce? The answer is not very easy at all. The first thing is that they had to be married for at least 3 years before a divorce could even be looked at. So that means you could have a marriage that was domestically violent or unhappy or adulterated, and there's nothing they could do about it. Now, first, it was the man who would file for divorce for adultery and those kind of things, and it was more difficult for women. And you've got to remember the stigma as well. I mean, you're going to look at a marriage breaking down in the 1950s, and people are going to think, oh, well, failed marriage, husband will probably be not good enough, or the wife wasn't running around with other men or something like that. And that was the stigma, not brought on by society itself, but more like their close families and friends. Now, when a divorce did take place, there were only 3 ways you could get a divorce, and that would be unfair treatment, adultery, or basically going missing. And that was it. And it would go into a high court, and this court obviously would be an open court for everybody to hear their dirty washing. So I can imagine there was a lot of reluctance, and this reluctance would lead to very unhappy marriages. There were sayings like, you need to stick with it, you made your vows and all that. And it wasn't until later on in years, I believe in 1974, where they changed the ruling that you could get divorced under the grounds of irretrievable breakdown of marriage. That's a lot of a gap. Legal aid was available in 1949, and back then that was to help with divorces because they went through courts. Legal aid is not available for divorce proceedings today. Now, just popping back to we are in the 1950s, but just popping back to the work environment. Women at work were only ever seen as a supplement for the household income and not a main earner. This is why the wages were much lower. So they'd do the same job as the man, but they get paid less because it was the man that was the main wage earner, and a few pennies just to top up the family income was why women would work back in the day. And what made matters worse, that if a woman became pregnant, she could legally be sacked. Now, the Women's Liberation Front was set up in 1959 to help combat these inequalities, and by the 1960s we'll see what they actually did. But was the 1960s any better for females? Well, let's have a look. Well, the 60s were bringing choice to women, medical advancements, particularly in 1961 when the contraceptive pill was released, which everybody called the pill. Now, initially, it was only made for married women, and doctors tended to prescribe it to older women that had got children that didn't want or couldn't cope with anymore. And they were very reluctant to give it to younger women, even though they were married, that didn't have children. Single women, no chance. It will be until 1974, with the introduction of the family planning clinics, where single women could actually get the contraceptive pill. That was 13 years after it was launched. So it wasn't really liberation, was it? It wasn't that freedom of women having their choices. Now, a simple thing like a woman walking into a pub on her own without a man was unheard of. In fact, it was probably frowned upon, and many landlords would refuse to serve her. They would just assume she's probably a lady of the evening soliciting for men. So it was either a group of women that went out together, but mainly it was with men, where men would go up the bar and buy a drink and expected the women to drink maybe half a pint or a soft drink. Although the swinging 60s didn't get its title until 1967, but women and young girls were beginning to go out in groups on their own, and the fashions made a difference to how women looked and how they wanted to look. Those war years had long gone, wearing great big long hand-me-down skirts and stuff like that. The fashion was arriving. It was the 1960s. Now, women were taking more jobs in the 1960s, albeit they were lower paid. But jobs were still being advertised as woman wanted or man wanted for these specific roles. And there were certain roles that women couldn't do, or they couldn't get, which would be like uniform jobs. Very hard to get into the police force or become a bus driver or a taxi driver or things like that. So it was definitely women's work. It would be sewing machinists or, like I said, secretarial work or cleaning work, school teachers, stuff like that. It was very rare for women to get promoted to any managerial jobs or decision-making jobs. Most managers were men. So let's, for example, you're going to go for a job interview and it's 1962 and you're a female and you're sat there waiting to be called into the interview and you notice there's a fella going for the same job. Well, you may as well have just walked out. And even though we have moved into the groovy 60s, the marriage bar was still in place and they were still sacking women if they became pregnant. In the household, many of the large decisions were made by the husbands or the man of the house. Women could sign for things such as writing on cheques or mortgages or loans or any sort of HP, but if they found out they had a husband, they would wait for the husband to countersign any documentation like that. So it was a man's world still. Now by 1962 there were 26,000 women that had signed up for university. University was great, but some of the people in high places, they didn't like the sound of this, and they thought to themselves, educate these women too much, it could be dangerous. But women's lib was gaining popularity and momentum, and I think the men were beginning to get scared. So we had advertisements, and advertisers were focused on women selling smaller cars, makeup and things like that to get women out there and fashion. But they were still advertising household domestic products such as cleaning, toilet cleaning stuff, all that, anything, and washing, all that was focused on the woman in the kitchen, whilst the man was advertised in the pub. Now, abortion rights, they were introduced in 1967, legalising women to have a choice. But this would take 2 doctors to agree to this abortion. So, albeit it was there, it was very young in its infancy regarding the rules and regulations. But it was a long way from those backstreet abortions which were dangerous. So it's 1969 and women's lib is well underway, getting vast publicity, and they are doing a lot more to get women more noticed for equality. Their first stint was in 1970 when they went on to live TV and they basically buggered up the Miss World competition. So the 1970s has arrived. Let's have a look what happened then. The fight for equal pay for women in 1970 was successful, well, on paper. But this took a few years for managers and bosses to actually get it underway. And that's because the government allowed them that time. But it also allowed them time to start thinking about changing the roles, changing the names of the roles, and thinking about certain redundancies. So we were still early on. But the movement actually began in 1968. And it was supported by the Minister of Labour, which was Barbara Castle, for the Labour government. 850 sewing machinists in Dagenham went on strike for equal pay, and they were successful. In 1975, this was amended to the Equal Pays Right. Now, this entitled women not only to get equal pay as men, but also equal bonuses, equal holidays, and equal pension rights. In 1975, we also see the end of the practice of sacking women who became pregnant, as it was outlawed, even though maternity pay was introduced in 1948. So there was no reason to do it, really. And also, in the same year, no longer were you allowed to advertise a job specifically for women or for men. The Women's Lib also succeeded in women's refuge centres being set up in 1972. And for battered wives, a refuge centre for those in 1973. Up until 1976, however, domestic violence was only considered as a domestic and police would not intervene. And that's for both men and women enduring domestic violence in the household. It was just named a domestic by the police and they would just simply walk away. This took years to be recognised as a crime, but the stigma was still there. For women and moreover for men. And it wasn't until 1990 where it was actually recognised for men to be a victim of domestic violence. But it was all very slow. All very slow in coming forward because of the stigma, because of obviously if you're a man being subject to physical violence from a woman, it's very difficult I would say both way rounds, but you know how proud men can be. Now, if that's happening to you, please come forward, whether you're male or female. Trust me, it works. I did it. 1979 saw a new female Prime Minister, where it was thought that women would have even more rights and even have more power and say in society. Now, ironically, in 1979 there were only 16 women who were in the cabinet at the time. That represented 3% of the whole cabinet. This was less than in 1951, where 6% of the cabinet were women. But this was an era of modern liberalism, wasn't it? Motivation for all, self-wealth. Remember that? Now we're in the 1980s, and unbelievably, some landlords were still refusing to serve women on their own in pubs. Well, that was thrown out the pub. That was abolished. But there were some city bars that would have women-only tables where men could be on their own to chat without the women being in the way. That was kicked out the pub. Some women attending job interviews, they were asked questions like, "Are you about to start a family?" That was also thrown out the window. So there was an influence. Things were moving forward. So I'm wondering now whether any of that still goes on. Well, I do know one thing, it still goes on in certain places. For example, there are still cases reported in the news where women are getting unequal pay, particularly in the BBC. But I'm hoping that this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. But it's an interesting look, and it was a quick look at how women in society really didn't get treated equally, and how many years it took, and how many rules and laws had to change just for everybody to be equal in our society in Britain. Well, that's the end of that bit, but I've got loads more on this channel, Social History, if you want to take a look. And thank you so much for watching. My name is Mickey Babington. Bye bye for now.